Okay, so we got context 2.0, and we got a royalty in the house gracing us with his presence, King Bob. So logic structures or knowledge structures, whatever we want to call them. So it's nothing more than just a way to like organize intents. Intents and the conversational system is still a rule-based system, so it still runs into the same issues as any rule-based system, which is rule conflicts. And so in order to kind of utilize the context to deconflict the rules and figuring out a way, like how do we traverse the user around this thing or traverse them within the conversational, we need some sort of a method to organize intents, right? So in this case, I have it very simply modeled out. I have general intent on the right-hand side, kind of see here in yellow, and I have tasks on the right-hand side, which you kind of see here, which is just tasks like stock price and rich content example. The general ones is things like greeting and conclusion. They're kind of like the supporting intents. And for this one here, rich content is where I'll spend most of the time. It breaks down into actual pieces of example of rich content, which I'll show with the next slide. And each one has a follow-up intent. And the follow-up intents have the same utterance as a trigger. So the question becomes, how does the system know which utterance to trigger? Because they're not like triggered programmatically, they're just triggered by user typing something in. So if I say yes, all of these intents technically would be like triggered, like these follow-up intents here, for example. So let's talk through like a quick progression of how a conversation goes. So let's say the user comes and says, I want to see, or what can you do, right? Capability check. And it says, I can show you examples of rich content. So the system says, okay. So it triggers that one. So once it triggers this rich content example that I have in red, it starts to manage context. And this is something that I have set up in Dialogflow. You don't really see it. So I'll kind of show it slightly visually here, with little circles. So it kind of starts to manage context like this. And it has like this, starts to constrain the structure a little bit. So now it can zoom in on specific intents, right? So let's say the user comes here and says, okay, show me an example of an image. And this is exactly what I'll do in a demo following this. So then another context gets activated, and it's this one here, kind of like this. So real quick. So something like this. And so now the system knows that in the image example, when it says, hey, do you want to see another example? And I say, sure, the follow-up intent to trigger is this one, the one that I've highlighted in yellow. So it's not any of the other ones that I have modeled out, even though they have the same utterance. So that context kind of like constrains the tree a little bit. I'll call it a tree, and the structure is kind of like a graph, really, and knows which intent to trigger. Now, of course, somebody might say, well, why not just have one follow-up intent? That sounds a lot simpler instead of this like crazy context within a context. It's like inception or something going on. And the answer is really we're trying to manage complexity versus customization, right? So it's a very feasible solution to just model out one follow-up intent. It wouldn't work for the purposes of demonstration. So for the demo, I have them set up as follow-up intents individually, and then they're a little bit customized, and I'll kind of show the slight customization that I have. But that's what context kind of like allows us to do. It allows us to constrain things, allows us to deconflict different intents, which are kind of like rule deconfliction, and allows us to start traversing the user around this graph where the user can like hop anywhere they want, really. What prevents it from just disseminating into complete chaos? Well, this mystical context that's in the background that the designer has kind of like thought through and modeled out and constrained things, you know, intricately, and the more intricate the constraint, the better the user experience, I guess, would be. But for the sake of this demo, let's say the user is in this follow-up intent, and then they say, sure, I want to see another example of rich content. I want to see an accordion. So like over here, this one gets triggered, right? So this context gets shifted like this in the system. And so now if it says, hey, do you want to see something else? And I say, sure, it triggers this follow-up intent. So now it manages the follow-up intents appropriately, even though the trigger for every single follow-up intent is the same. So besides rule deconfliction, the observation here is that we can reuse utterances. So now if we have a system that's like, 50 intents, 100 intents, 200 intents, we can reuse the same utterances. We don't have to have unique utterance for every single one, because that would be very difficult. And the more intents you have, the more likely the system is to just start to get confused. It's harder and harder to like come up with really, really unique utterances and train your algorithm so it really can able to like differentiate between different ones. But if we have context in our bag of tools that we can use to manage the conversation, we can simplify our life a little bit easier, make it a little bit more manageable, right? So let's do an example live here. We got Minnie and Bob. Help us out. So let's say I'm a user. I'll kind of keep these on the screen a little bit, but I'll show progression. So as a semi-knowledgeable user, I'll just hop straight into examples of rich content. So show examples of rich content. Something like this, right? And he shows me. So here, for the sake of the demo, we're kind of like over here. Right, and you can see he gives us 7: info, response, description, image, buttons, list, accordion, and chips. Right, so maybe I want to see an image example, and we got our minion alarm. So essentially what happened is it triggered over here in our knowledge structure, and it activated that next intent. So now we're still in that image example intent, the way I have it set up, and it says, would you like to see another fun, rich content element? And let's say as a user, I say, sure, continue to entertain me. And it says pick one. So now notice, first of all, we hopped into this follow-up intent here. That's the second one. And the other one is, if you notice on the screen, the image is not one of the options. So this is the little customization that I made, essentially, that we just saw image, so I put it in one of the options, right? Obviously, this is a very simple customization, just for simple demo purposes. But it's not there. And so now let's say I want to see an example of an accordion. This one, right? I say, sure, show me an accordion. So what happened with our structure now? So now we just kind of like hopped over here, triggered this one. We're out of these. And it shifted the context over here. So now we have an example of an accordion element. It's Bob and his friends goofing around as usual, doing God knows what. I don't know what minions do. Trying to appease their master, I think. But it says, would you like to see another example? And so let's say I say, sure. So now we've triggered this follow-up intent, right? And the way you know that this is a different intent is you can see now that the image is one of the options, right? But now the accordion is missing. So we're kind of like leaving one out that we just saw. So a very simple customization, nothing fancy, but you can see how kind of like the ability to manage that context allows us to reuse utterances and keep saying like, yes, sure, show me another example, but it triggers a different follow-up intent. And of course, in a real system, we can make this, the follow-up intents a lot more customizable, a lot higher degree of customization, or completely different, but have the same triggers, the yes or whatever the trigger is. So that's kind of like the big thing behind it. And this is really, really useful, especially if you're doing a lot of the systems out there, they answer questions. They're like for information seekers. And when you have a lot of Q&As or frequently asked questions, they tend to be kind of similar. And so context management allows you to kind of like break them up, organize the content a little bit better, and deconflict, so you can have the user and have your questions set up in such a way that the user can directly answer trigger the question without having to like navigate through anything. But you have to deconflict the rules. Otherwise, the whole system will just get confused and it'll just be too much of like a soup sandwich almost with the rules, because it's a kind of a common problem for rule-based systems to have these conflicts. And so context allows us to solve just that. So last but not least, somebody might say, give an observation. I'll kind of give just a little bit of an insight here, running short on time. Let's say we're in this accordion example here, and the follow-up intent is in the context, right? But can we set, let's say, this to be a context, follow-up context, and maybe something else within a context, like over here, and like somewhere else in a tree? And the answer is yes. And so the question becomes like, well, how do we know which intents to kind of like link together with this mystical context? Because you don't have to think of context as these circles, but more like, if I were to get rid of all this, as like the yellow ones. They're in the context of the red one. in this case, the accordion example, just for demo purposes. And this is where we kind of move away from just pure dialogue management, that low-level kind of exchange management, to conversation design. Like this, the architecture of the entire thing, like the human experience, because when we converse as humans, we're not just like trading information just for the fun of it. We're essentially altering each other's perceptions of the world, kind of like our brain's model of the context around us is what I like to think of perception as. And when we start to design the conversation and thinking about like how do we traverse the user around this entire structure, like where do they go next? This is where the next push kind of comes up, and the next skill set is like that conversation design the overall thing, thinking it through, seeing the how the users navigate things, what is their knowledge base when they come to use the system, because that's going to dictate how you manage context and how you rig things up. What is from the designer's perspective, from the system designer's perspective, like what are they trying to accomplish? What is the purpose of the system? How does it help the users? And so all of these things kind of come together and ultimately allows us to do a conversation design where we allow the system to converse with the user to facilitate task completion or answer inquiries or anything like that. And so that's the next big topic, conversation design. And I'll kind of leave it on a little bit of a cliffhanger here, but that's the next push. So thanks again for watching. Until next time.